Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the Oxford World English Symposium. My name is Danica Salazar, and I am World English Editor for Oxford Languages, the department of Oxford University Press that publishes the Oxford English Dictionary, as well as other dictionaries and lexical datasets of English and a wide range of other languages. In this presentation, I will give you a brief introduction to the OED's coverage of world varieties of English. The Oxford English Dictionary is widely regarded as a definitive record of the English language. The OED is an historical dictionary, meaning that unlike most dictionaries which focus on current meanings of words, the OED also shows the history of individual words, traced through quotations taken from written examples of authentic language use. The latest edition of the OED is accessible through OED Online, where updates are published quarterly. In the OED, we take world Englishes to mean those localized or indigenized varieties of English spoken throughout the world by people of diverse cultural backgrounds in a wide range of social linguistic contexts. On this map, you can see in dark blue those countries where English is spoken as a first language, and in light blue, those where English is spoken as a second language. British regional varieties of English, such as Manx English and Welsh English, regional varieties of English in other countries where English is spoken as a majority language, such as Canadian English and Australian English, post-colonial regional varieties such as Nigerian English, Jamaican English, Singapore English, and Indian English, and even sociolectal varieties such as African American English are within the scope of world Englishes in the OED. Now, let us go to the OED and look for a typical World English entry in the dictionary. So if we search, for example, for mama put, this is the OED entry for the word mama put. What information can we find for this word in this entry? At the very top, in red, you see the head word mama put, along with the part of speech, a noun in this case. This is followed by a pronunciation section providing different pronunciation variants for mama put transcribed in the International Phonetic Alphabet or IPA. You can also hear audio recordings of these pronunciations if you click on the blue play button. Next, the inflection section indicates that mama put can be pluralized with or without the s suffix. This is followed by a form section which lists the spelling variants of the word mama put, one where it is spelled as two words, which is the most common form, another where the two words are hyphenated, and another where it is spelled as one word. Next, the etymology section also gives an explanation of how mama put was formed in English. So if you click show more, you can see the whole of it. So it states that mama put is a combination of the noun mama, meaning mother, and the verb put, probably originally reflecting the first part of a request mama put with the verb in the imperative, asking for food to be put for or given to a customer in a food stall, which is how you usually order food in a mama put. After this, the label for this entry explicitly states that mama put is a word used in Nigerian English. Moving on to the definition, which explains that a mama put is a street vendor, typically a woman, selling cooked food at low prices from a hand cart or stall. It also states that a mama put can be a street stall or roadside restaurant run by such a vendor, and that it is also used as a mass noun to refer to the type of food sold by such vendors. The definition also cross-refers to OED entries for other Nigerian English words with the same meaning, buka and bukateria. Mama put just happens to be a straightforward entry with one major sense that can be described in one definition paragraph, but a number of OED entries are much more complex than this and are divided into several senses, subsenses, compounds, and phrases. The longest entry in the dictionary is currently the verb to run, which has over 600 different meanings and uses and took 9 months for one OED editor to revise. Finally, after the definition is a series of chronologically arranged quotations illustrating the use of mama put. The earliest evidence of this word being used in English that OED editors could find is from an academic research article published in the Journal of Environmental Management in 1979. This is followed by later quotations spanning 4 decades, from a 2006 entry in an encyclopedia of sex work, the 2012 novel The Spider King's Daughter by Nigerian author Chibundo Onuzo, and a tweet posted in 2016 by a Nigerian Twitter user. Quotations in an OED entry are chosen in order to demonstrate the period of time over which every meaning of a word is evidenced, or if the word is obsolete, when it fell out of use, the geographical spread of the term, the types of sources in which it occurs, and its typical registers of use. On the right side of each OED entry is information on whether an entry is a new entry in the dictionary or whether it has been revised or is still unrevised. This information is provided because the OED is a work in progress. Every 3 months, the entire OED database is updated online, with new words added for the first time and older entries revised according to modern standards of historical lexicography. These quarterly updates are available exclusively online on OED.com. Now let's go back to our slides. The OED is not just a dictionary with a lot of old words in it. It is itself an old dictionary. It was born in the Victorian era, at a time when the homogenization and standardization of language was viewed as the main function of the dictionary, in line with the predominant scientific thinking of the period. This is a picture of James Murray, the OED's first chief editor during the late 19th century and early 20th century. Phil Benson argued in 2001 that the English dictionary is a historically specific form of discourse embedded within broader discourses that represent knowledge of the world in terms of metaphors of center and periphery, with the center generally being understood as standard British English and the periphery as everything else outside the standard. The OED, despite the undeniable rigor of its historical methodology, cannot wholly escape criticisms for this perceived ethnocentrism. As a matter of fact, James Murray himself, in his general explanations that prefaced the first fascicle of the OED, published in 1884, used the center-periphery metaphor in describing the scope of English. In this diagram, Murray identifies a core of English words whose, in his words, Anglicity is unquestioned. Outside this core is what we would consider today to be the bulk of World English lexis, dialectal and foreign words, words beyond what was then recognized as standard British English. Murray's model is well known in lexicography and has been used to justify policies of word inclusion and exclusion for the OED and subsequent dictionaries. To be fair to Murray and our 19th century predecessors, this apparent ethnocentrism is not born out of a deliberate neglect of non-British cultures. In fact, James Murray is known to have been a staunch defender of the place of foreign and dialectal words in the OED. It can be seen, rather, through the way that these non-British items are presented entirely through the lens of Victorian Britain as a response to the needs and interests of the British Empire at the time. A good example of this is the OED entry for abaca, which appears on page 5 of the 1884 Aid to Ant fascicle of the OED, the very first incarnation of the dictionary. I like using this as an example so I can say that the Philippines has been represented in the OED from the very first pages of the very first installment. But if you actually look at the entry, it is obvious that abaca's Philippine-ness is peripheral to the entry, and that the word made it into the dictionary by virtue of its significance to British industry, being a material used in making everyday objects used in Britain. Again, to be fair to James Murray and Company, their editorial choices were limited by the chiefly British and American research sources they had access to in Oxford during their time. These limitations led to a certain bias in the OED towards loan words relating to flora, fauna, ethnic groups, and other items of mostly historical and anthropological interest. In a 2008 article, Kingsley Bolton and Susan Butler called this type of vocabulary Webster words, since they observed their prevalence not only in the OED but also in other dictionaries such as Webster's. However, there has been a huge paradigm shift in mainstream linguistics in the 20th century. All forms of language are now given equal value, at least in theory. We now believe that linguistic variation is a natural consequence of cultural diversity, that a language such as English that has been transplanted into new environments tends to adapt to these environments, and that national or regional varieties of languages serve to express national or regional identities. The OED, of course, has had to respond to this paradigm shift. In a 1986 article, one of the chief editors of the OED's 1989 second edition, Edmund Weiner, acknowledged the ad hoc treatment of regional English items in the first edition and in subsequent supplements and discussed possible ways of applying a more articulated policy in the second edition. Finally, in 2000, with the launch of the third edition, then chief editor John Simpson explicitly recognized the status of English as a world language and the change of status of British English from being the only standard to being one of many to be covered by the dictionary. The Financial Times put it best in a 2016 article when it said that the OED finds itself in the curious position of being a national institution called upon, almost by default, to assume the role of a global one. Right now, the OED is undergoing its first thoroughgoing revision and update since it was first published in 1928. This project employs over 70 editors based in Oxford and New York. The dictionary's third and latest edition is accessible through OED Online, where updates are published quarterly, as I mentioned earlier. It is to this current edition that we're now applying the new approach to World English vocabulary that John Simpson describes in his preface. However, certain issues still remain, which I will now discuss, along with some examples of how the OED is addressing them. There is the fact that dictionaries have always been one of the principal tools in the establishment of the linguistic standard. The dictionary, as an ordered inventory of the words that make up a unitary ideal of language, becomes the ultimate authority on usage, what people turn to in order to find out what is original, pure, and proper. Linguists and lexicographers may believe otherwise, but many ordinary dictionary users still think that any deviation from the standard has no place in a dictionary. The best response here seems to be to use the same linguistic ideology that has made dictionaries such an effective tool in the promotion of the standard to change the way previously marginalized varieties are perceived, as suggested by Sargent in 2011. Documenting words from these varieties in dictionaries such as the OED serves as a strong argument for the recognition of their own separate norms, which can be considered equal to those of standard British and American English. It also gives speakers of these varieties the assurance that the English they use is legitimate and helps them recognize themselves as members of a distinct language community. As Susan Butler put it in 1997, being able to say that your words are in a dictionary in general has more effect on the public perception of the validity of a variety than many words spent in linguistic theorizing. The OED's reputation as a linguistic authority can turn it into an instrument for promoting diversity. The OED can put varieties formerly in the periphery in the center by recognizing the plurality of centers of English. We can do this in a variety of ways. First, in our word selection. At Oxford Languages, we have several resources at our disposal to track the emergence of new words and senses from world Englishes. We no longer have the same limitations faced by editors of earlier editions of the OED, especially since the internet has given us wider access to non-UK and non-US sources of linguistic evidence. We use language corpora, which are collections of different types of written and spoken speech put together in an electronic database designed specifically for language research, to generate frequency counts that help us prioritize emerging World English words for inclusion. We also use other World English corpora available, such as the Corpus of Web-Based Global English, or GLOBE. We also have the Oxford Reading Program, which is our digital collection of sentences or short extracts drawn from a huge variety of writing by volunteer readers. We also source possible candidates through the review of existing dictionaries and lexical studies carried out by language scholars and through searches of large databases of historical and modern text. We collaborate with a network of consultants working on various World English varieties. We also launch crowdsourcing initiatives in order to ask for word suggestions from the very speakers of World Englishes. Once you have a list of candidates, OED editors go to work carefully researching our electronic and paper research databases to make sure that there are several independent examples of the word being used for a reasonable amount of time and reasonable frequency in the places you would expect to find them. There is no exact time span or frequency threshold, as this may vary depending on each word. Some words are relatively young, but they were quickly added to the OED because of the huge social impact that they had in such a short space of time. Other words are not overwhelmingly frequent but are included because they are of specific cultural, historical, or linguistic significance. All of these new research resources enable us to shift our attention towards more contemporary lexis and mechanisms of lexical innovation beyond the simple borrowing of exotic terms. In our current work, we are focusing on documenting vocabulary which shows mechanisms of lexical innovation beyond the simple borrowing of exotic terms, as I said. So these include strategies of word creation, such as the adding of affixes, the shortening of words, the creation of new word combinations, the preservation in certain varieties of words and sentences that are already archaic or obsolete in other varieties. There's also the invention of new initialisms and acronyms, calquing or loan translation, the direct translation of an expression from another language into English, the combination of English words with words from other languages, the conversion of words from one part of speech to another. And of course, there is complete semantic change where words change meaning entirely, such as the examples on this slide. We're also adding more words from semantic fields that are of particular interest to actual speakers of World English varieties, not just to British or American lexicographers or linguistic anthropologists looking at the variety from an outsider perspective. We have recently included more words from such culturally specific domains as food and drink, places to eat, modes of transport, and one that I find particularly fascinating, kinship terms. Lexical items that may be considered peripheral in standard British English and forms no part of the vocabulary of British English speakers are given space in the OED. For instance, the calamansi, probably known only to Brits and Americans as a decorative plant with orange fruits, sometimes sold at IKEA, is to Filipinos a green fruit that is as essential to their cooking as the lemon is here. Brits or Americans have no need to know what an HDB is unless they happen to live in Singapore, where it's as ubiquitous as the word flat is in the UK or apartment is in the US. The OED has also formulated specific pronunciation models for World English varieties, which can all be consulted on the OED website. We use these models to provide variety-specific IPA transcriptions for World English items accompanied by recorded audio pronunciation. So, if you have, say, a South African English word like skedonk, you get the IPA transcriptions and audio pronunciations in British and American English, as is standard for all OED entries and apart from obsolete ones. But you also get the IPA transcription in South African English and hear the word being pronounced in a South African accent. So let's go to the OED now and see if we can try that. So we search for skedonk. So if you click here,
Skedonk.
that's a British pronunciation.
Skedonk.
The US pronunciation.
Skedonk.
And the South African English pronunciation. We also think it is important for World English words in the dictionary to be illustrated by quotations from works written by speakers of the varieties in question and published in their place of origin. Consider, for instance, this entry for the name of a typical Filipino dish, adobo, added to the OED in 2005. It is a perfectly good OED entry, but if you look at the quotation paragraph, there is actually not a single quotation coming from a Filipino source. They are all American. Now compare that to this entry for another Filipino dish, sisig, published more recently. So you can see that in this case, all the quotations come from Filipino sources, which we now have greater access to thanks to internet databases such as Google Books and Nexus, and even social media sites such as Twitter, which we now also quote in the OED. We also now recognize that in most places where English is spoken as a second language, code switching is the dominant form of communication, and this is apparent even in the written register. See, for instance, the following antedating for kilig adjective that was brought to our attention via a recent OED appeal to our users for evidence. Previously, an OED editor might dismiss this quotation as an unusable Taglish sentence, but this has now been added to the entry, antedating kilig from 1994 to 1981. By the way, kilig means like this kind of butterflies that you feel in your stomach due to an exciting or especially romantic experience. So we now consider this is an acceptable quotation as the base language of this sentence is actually English with Tagalog words inserted. These insertions are not due to the writer's lack of competence or his or her non nativeness. They are there for discoursal reasons because that's just how Filipinos who speak Philippine English express themselves. So it is not unlike a Francophile British English speaker saying something like, these jazz joints become the dernier cri because they employ bands that play with such eclat and panache that they give me frissons and send shivers down my spine. And you'll notice that words such as éclat and panache and frissons are French origin words that are also considered English words and are covered in the OED. So we try to remember that what sounds unnatural to an OED editor who may not speak a certain variety of English may sound perfectly natural to a speaker of such a variety. And it is the World English speaker whose usage of the language we are trying to represent accurately. Moving World Englishes from the periphery to the center in the OED entails not just documenting their idiosyncratic lexicons, it also means using more World English sources to illustrate general English words. In other words, if works of classic English literature and the most important of British and American newspapers appear regularly in our quotation paragraphs to show the development of everyday English words, then why not the works of post colonial writers in English? Why not newspapers read in other parts of the English speaking world? We aim to do this by adding more and more World English publications to the OED reading program. So, as you can see in this slide, we have several hundred quotations, for example, from Nigerian playwright and Nobel Prize winner Wole Soyinka. And if a word is known but not found in a dictionary, the user may assume that it's not just part of a language, that it is not a word. What do we do about this when it is a practical impossibility to add all World English words? The answer lies in new ways of accessing the dictionary. The OED's digital format has taken away the restrictions of alphabetization and enabled its users to explore the dictionary in ways beyond looking up individual words. John Simpson noted in 2013 how advances in computational lexicography have shifted the focus of interest from single word lookups to more general investigations of linguistic trends. The OED's timeline feature, for instance, enables a user to generate graphs that show the number of words first recorded by the OED within different time periods, which can be limited by various subject, region, and origin categories. The graph here illustrates the patterns of borrowing from Tagalog throughout 10 centuries of the history of the English language, which should be of interest to researchers of Philippine English. With this change in how users access the content of the OED, achieving coverage of a World English variety that is comprehensive enough to clearly show the patterns of lexical innovation throughout its history is becoming more important than the inclusion of any single word. It is apparent that a more wide ranging selection of vocabulary that reflects the actual lexical creativity of its World English users matters much more, and is much more achievable than any possible notion of completeness. Another issue is that the presence of a label in an entry can imply that the item is somehow different to the norm. The appropriate response here seems to be to make labeling more useful and to provide more discursive information. See, for instance, this unrevised entry for jeepney with really sparse information that does not tell the reader much about the jeepney's significance in Philippine transport. Compare this again to this new entry for sisig, which includes not just a discursive label relating to Filipino cookery, but also an additional small type note that tells the reader more about the origins of the dish, its possible variations, when it is eaten, and even cross refers to the Filipino food custom of pulutan, for which the OED also has an entry. These are the principles that we try to follow in our current World English work. On this slide are just some of the World English projects that the OED has carried out in the past few years, along with its upcoming projects. But there is still room for critique, for new ideas, for research resources and technologies, for new ways to exploit the vast amounts of data stored in the OED. World Englishes provide a particularly fertile ground for innovation in the OED as they bring up a variety of research questions that push us to re examine our practices and policies. Looking to the future, the OED's goal for World English is to fulfill the needs of its increasingly global audience through wide ranging, inclusive, and representative coverage of their words and usage. This can only be achieved through collaboration with local partners, and so the OED is introducing several new ways of engaging with the World English's research community. There is the OED Research Advisory Group, an invitation only group for academics who use the OED in their research and are willing to participate in surveys, forum discussions, and other tasks within the REG interface in order to share other ideas and expertise relating to different aspects of the dictionary's ongoing projects on World Englishes. There's also OED Labs, an initiative which invites scholars of various fields to contribute to the development of new functionalities for the exploration of OED content, and the OED Researcher API, a tool that enables researchers to make use of datasets extracted from across the OED to support research in a wide variety of disciplines. There's also the OED Appeals page, where we sometimes ask the public for help in finding antidatings for our World English entries. With every new development, the OED is evolving into something much more than a dictionary. It is now becoming a dynamic and flexible lexical database that can be a starting point or a regular stop in the research journey of scholars seeking to investigate World English, the lexicon of World Englishes. By adding new words, revising existing entries, and developing better tools and methodologies, the OED is increasing the quantity and further improving the quality of its lexical data so that it can be an even bigger, more balanced, more representative, and more reliable data set that can help researchers answer a variety of questions on how English is used by different communities around the world. So the OED can help answer questions like, is this word really a coinage in my variety or a preserved archaic use? A simple OED lookup can verify this. What are the dominant semantic fields in a variety, and what do they say about the specific culture and societal concerns of this community? For example, circling back to kinship terms, the OED's inclusion of such terms in Asian varieties of English show how the speech etiquette of Asian cultures features a complex system of kinship terms and terms of address, in which age, gender, status, and family relationships are marked by highly specific vocabulary with no direct equivalents in English. This lexical gap is therefore filled by borrowing such words from local languages or adapting existing English words. How do the historical links between different geographical areas manifest in lexical terms? For instance, what are the lexical commonalities between West African Englishes, Caribbean Englishes, and African American English? Which substrate languages most influence a variety? During which time periods have there been more contact between English and a certain substrate language? What are the mechanisms of lexical innovation that characterize a specific variety? How have spelling conventions changed for certain World English words? What are the similarities and differences between varieties with regard to pronunciations? The OED can also provide insight not just in lexical history, but history in general. I remember writing an article once about Philippine political history and how it is reflected in the Philippine English words in the dictionary. Indeed, the OED's World English content can have research applications not just in linguistics, but also in anthropology, history, cultural studies, literary studies, and many other fields. On this final slide are just some links to know more about World Englishes in the OED. You can explore the OED's Varieties of English pages, which have all kinds of information on the varieties of English covered by the dictionary. We also regularly publish posts on the OED blog on different aspects of variation in English, and we also frequently host webinars on world English topics with guest speakers from all over the world. The Oxford Languages COVID-19 Hub also has content on World English vocabulary during the pandemic and translations of key COVID-19 terminology into different languages. Thanks once again for joining me in this presentation, and please do enjoy the rest of the symposium.